The business of medicine is constantly changing. The review by Resolve discusses current contract issues for physicians, compensation trends, and tips for a successful career. Every physician's contract and career is different, and nothing in this episode should be considered legal advice. If you have specific questions about your career, please consult with an attorney. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to the review. Here today with Brady Glissendorf, another attorney at Resolve. We're going to talk today about a topic that I think gets overlooked by a lot of clients or by physicians doing it themselves if they're not hiring an expert to go through this with them, which is, I'm going to call it duties, responsibilities, scheduling, right? Kind of what you're supposed to do day in and day out. So I guess from your standpoint, when clients come in, one, are they aware that they should be looking at that? And two, what are some of the big questions they have?
Yeah, I think it is something that they're aware of, or at least they have certain expectations coming into the discussion, at least from their employer. But I think the important thing is that it's a lot of times the language doesn't really translate well from their discussions to the contract.
Right. So they go through the interview process and they're told, hey, this is where you're going to work, and this is what your schedule is going to look like. And then we see the document and it says not much.
No, it doesn't say much. It basically says that it's going to be as assigned by the employer or within their discretion. So it kind of takes that control away.
Yeah. How many, and this is, again, I'm going to ask you for gut. There's no specific statistic on this, but how many of your clients want that detail in the contract?
I say more often than not. I'd say a good majority want at least some detail in the contract, just to have a little bit more clear expectations in terms of, what their day-to-day is going to be like, how many hours each week, coverage responsibilities. I mean, I think it is actually a big, important detail to a lot of clients. Yeah.
Do you see a distinction between certain specialties? Like some specialties care more about this versus others?
I think so. I think there's some in terms of, maybe specialty physicians maybe have a little bit more detail that they want to have in the contract. Especially if you're looking at like surgeons, wanting to have, maybe OR block time or, some of those types of things where they want to have things carved out. Even like admin time for those types of responsibilities. So I think it depends, but a lot of times you want to have just some things carved out, at least in terms of your schedule.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you on that. I think the people that are not just primary care, right, that are going to be in a endoscopy suite or OR, slots, that they like to have a day for that or half day blocks for that, so they can plan their schedule and try to be efficient with that. The other thing that I've noticed is that with the expansion of health systems, with the expansion of even academic centers, there's often like 5, 6, 7 locations that they might be able to work in. So is that similar? Is it pretty broad in the contract as far as what location they'll be at?
It can be really broad. And I think this is actually a really important issue where there's a lot of times an expectation to come in that you're going to be at 1 or 2 maybe locations, but then they leave within the contract a lot of discretion for the employer to say, hey, we can actually move you to a different one. So that's one where we always, similar to the schedule, we want to make sure that there's a little bit of kind of mutual language, basically saying that there's going to be this discussion between the employer and the physician for, what that's actually going to look like during the contract.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it matters for a lot of reasons. I mean, the footprints right now of health systems are large. I mean, it can be, 100 plus miles where they've got locations all over the place. But then too, it's, if I'm from a family standpoint, I've got to buy a house or I've got to live somewhere, right? Where do I live? What's my commute going to look like? If I'm going to be, at one location, it's pretty easy to make that decision. If it's, 2 or 3 or 4, maybe I pick a center location. And so, trying to get some definition around that. I agree. Most of my clients are interested in that. How about call? Is call well-defined? Because that ties into scheduling.
Yeah, I think it's not usually well-defined. I think it's also, again, a lot of times on the employer's discretion kind of to dictate that call schedule. And I think they're usually a little bit more touchy around the call as well. They want to keep that definitely within their discretion to be able to kind of dictate that coverage. But I think for us, we'd also like to see more, at least some cap language on it, to say that you're not going to go, above a certain amount of that responsibility. So it might be a little bit of a different discussion as opposed to, your general kind of schedule, locations, et cetera. But it's still something that we want to have a little bit more control at least, or level the expectations at least.
Right. Yeah, I think the concept of equal call, right, is something that I think most people expect to be there, and I think that's what they're told in the interview process. A lot of times it doesn't even say equal call. It could be that you're the new person, you're going to take, all the holidays, which nobody wants. But also people leave, right? So if there's a group of 4 of you and you're on 1 and 4 call, and then, 2 guys retire and one person gets in a car accident and all of a sudden you're the only one left, those are the situations where contractually we want to say, go find that locum coverage, right? Don't make me do all of it for that time frame until you can hire somebody else. And so we know that one of the things that comes up in every burnout study, right, is that scheduling, right, and flexibility and autonomy are important to physicians. And so call is certainly that after-hour component that ties into it. So red flags, I guess, if we're going to say, hey, here's the things to look out for, what do you think they should be paying attention to in those sections?
Yeah, I think a lot of times the language is pretty vague in terms of, if you see language, basically saying that it's, minimum 40 hours per week, as, schedule as designed by the employer or as, dictated by the employer. That's the kind of language that you want to take a closer look at and see, hey, can we kind of shift the burden on this, kind of shift it to be more of a discussion and make that, add some flexibility for the physician for sure. So I think that's some of the language.
Yeah, kind of that broad language that removes any control of the physician on that.
Exactly.
How about you mentioned something earlier I want to come back to. You said admin time, which in my mind kind of ties into like your FTE status and how they divvy that up. Are contracts good about that definition? Are they too broad on it? What do clients want to see there?
I'd say more often than not, they're pretty broad on it. A lot of times, even the contract, sometimes it doesn't even spell out, what that FTE is or what, that actual split should be, or especially, what those duties would be like for that admin time or what that split is. So,
and full-time FTE just means full-time equivalent, right?
Yep,
For the people that don't know. So it's, if you're 40 hours a week, that's 1.0. If you're, going to work 4 days a week, it's 0.8.
Yep.
And so sometimes we'll see like, here's 0.1 for this and here's 0.2 for that type of thing. And so, you're saying usually that's not there.
Usually it's not. Sometimes it'll be pretty vague in terms of like, we've got, 0.1 dictated for this, but it doesn't really spell out kind of what those duties are actually within that split. So I think more around that, especially if you want to have things protected for, that's the big thing. Having that actually spelled out in the contract.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So takeaways then for, any physicians that are just listening and not, having an expert go through their contract would be one, I guess, pay attention to it, right? It's probably going to be important to you.
Yep.
Not only where you work location wise, but what your schedule is going to be. If you need carve outs in the FTE status, pay attention to that. Try to get language that's not unilateral one way for the employer. Anything else that would fall into this category?
Yeah, no, I think that kind of spells it all out. I think it's the biggest thing is just kind of keeping that flexibility on your end. I think that's the most important factor.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's I think a good recap, and I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet.